we should probably make a start. So, welcome to this afternoon's Education Forum. In fact, this is my very first Education Forum, and I gather from Claire that they were running before the pandemic, but this is the first one where we're back with a hybrid event, so great to see so many of you in person, but we're also joined by a number of people online. I'm Emma McCoy, for those of you that I haven't met yet, and great to be here. So I think it's going to be quite interesting to see how these events run at LSE. Many of you will know that I was previously at Imperial, where we had a similar kind of annual conference. So I gather this is termly here. What's particularly nice, I think, is that we have such a cross-section of our community, and I think that's from the professional services divisions, academic departments and institutes, and of course students all coming together to discuss matters related to education and student experience. We're focusing on community and student voice today, and we've seen from student surveys that this is an area that, as is true across the sector, where I think we need to do quite a lot of work to improve. It's not just the NSS, which clearly is kind of now becoming part of our regulatory framework through things like TEF, but obviously all of the surveys that we do internally as well. So I do think it's an area that we need to work on. So I'm really looking forward to some of the discussions. And I should apologise, but my diary is kind of insane at the moment with all the annual monitoring meetings, and I have to dash off actually to the Extended Education Committee meeting at about 2:45, so I can only stay for the first 45 minutes, but nonetheless I'm really looking forward to today. I do want to say a few words about student voice in particular, because in my experience, what that means, or how universities have handled student voice traditionally, has been either through surveys or through student representation on things like committees. And of course we've done more at LSE, which is great, and I'll say a little bit about that later on. But I do think that student representation is clearly important, but it provides us with, I think, some challenges. And I'll say a little bit more about surveys later on as well. But with student rep networks, I think it puts the students in quite a difficult position, because they're both trying to advocate for kind of all students, but then we're also asking them to be kind of partners in our kind of quality assurance. And I think that that provides quite a tricky tension. So I think that we do need to find other mechanisms beyond those that are kind of more traditional. And I think that, of course, even though I know at LSE we have the representation on all of our committees with students, and I think that obviously we have the surveys, but that only tells half of the story, because I think what we need to do is make sure that with things like surveys, it reminds me very much of when I first started teaching during the pandemic. It felt like I was just speaking to into a black box, and it was very hard for me to gauge whether the students were understanding what I was saying. It was very hard for me to feel the feedback, and I think certainly our students probably feel exactly the same when they fill in their surveys. And I know that today we're going to be talking about how we properly close those feedback loops, because I think it's important that we do. Now, as I said, with student representation, I think that there are responsibilities on both sides of the equation. So even though we have conflicts for the students in terms of they have to be advocates and activists in some respects, I think for us as well, we have a responsibility for truly including students in those networks. It can quickly dissolve into a bit of an us and them situation, and I have seen that. I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done badly in several departments in my experience from when I was at Imperial, and I'll be interested in your reflection on how student representation works at LSE. I would imagine it's probably quite similar. Now, of course, I think many staff here will ensure that they have a proper dialogue with their students through their modules or through departmental activities, and I know that that happens in, LSE, in the courses that run across the school, LSE Live courses, LSE 100 and so on. But I think we need to think further about how we embed student voice into our education more broadly, rather than these kind of transactional mechanisms that we have at the moment. And of course we do that through things like change makers here and the student education panel. But I would still argue that
that is sometimes limited to a small number of students, and we have talked about this already, because it is going to be those that are kind of keen and want to engage. They'll put themselves forward. They're the ones that probably are educationally doing quite well already, and they're the ones that have the time and space to be able to commit to those kind of activities. And I think that, I guess it is probably, I've seen it's one of the earlier sessions, I think what we need to do is how do we embed student voice just much more broadly in our education, and indeed even in our assessment practices. So I think that we have the opportunity to be really creative with how we actually use student voice across all of our teaching. And I know that that is happening with some of the innovative practices already, but from what I have seen and heard and discussed with departments and staff, it's not embedded across the entire school. It's just, you know, scattered pieces of good practice. And again, I'm probably preaching to the converted when I come and speak at these events, because I'm not reaching the entire academic community. So I suppose that would be, I suppose, my request to you to discuss how we can introduce these kind of things much more through the curriculum. And I know it's something that Mark and I have discussed, and he's also thinking about working on with Claire and the team in Eden as well. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what's happening across the school. Make sure I'm standing in the right place. And we have a really interesting agenda today that are combining presentations on research, good practice from departments and so on. And we are very hopeful that some of this will also feed into the upcoming TEF submission, which we have to get in towards the end of January, particularly suggestions and approaches for how we can improve student voice in our community. So thank you very much for the warm welcome that I've received so far at LSE, and I'm going to hand back to Claire, who will introduce the rest of the day.
For coming along. We know that by the time we get to week 9 of Michaelmas term, everyone's almost on their knees, so it's great to have everybody here this afternoon. I hope for some creative thinking, sharing practice, and community building. I'm not going to say very much because I want to get on with the agenda, but I have to do the housekeeping. I just want to let you know, I also want to welcome our colleagues online. We want you to be able to, we've got 19 colleagues online so far. We hope you feel fully fledged participants in our Education Forum today. We've got colleagues from the Eden Centre watching the chat, bringing you in. So thanks for joining from afar as well. We are recording this afternoon. If you've got concerns about that, please speak to a member of the Eden Centre team standing over in the corner. I always like to thank the colleagues in the Eden Centre team for all the work they do behind the scenes at the beginning of these events, because I know that by the time you get towards 3:30, 4, you're already out the door mentally. So let's give them a round of applause at that. I have the sort of privilege of being the timekeeper this afternoon, so I will be trying to keep us more or less on track, because there is another, I don't know if it's a lecture class, but there's something coming in here at 4 o'clock this afternoon, so we do really have to, maybe that will be music to your ears, that we're not planning to go beyond the scheduled time. So what we're going to do to get things going, try and model what we like to think is good participant-centred practice, is to ask you in groups of 3 or 4, so we've created these kind of arcs, but you might want to create your own arcs, and Lawrence is going to put our colleagues online into breakout groups. We've got 4 questions that we want you to consider. You're going to have about 10 minutes, so you might not get to all of them, so pick ones you're interested in. What do you understand by student voice? Because in the higher education sector, in sort of 1KG and other posts, people use these terms like voice, partnership, almost virtue signalling that these things matter. But what do we actually mean when we talk about authentic student voice? What does it mean for us at LSE? What does it mean for our students? We want to hear about examples of good practice in your departments, what you've heard, what you've seen in the sector more broadly. And then that final question, which is one that's always something that really we clearly don't do so well at LSE, which is closing the loop on that student feedback. So we may be regularly asking students for feedback in all sorts of different areas, but how do we actually communicate back to students what we've done with their feedback? And I just want to say that I don't think there are huge numbers of students in the room, but we have made a really big effort this time to try and invite members of our student community, because it seems like a bit of a contradiction in terms to organise a session looking at student voice and community and only be talking among ourselves. So welcome to our student participants, our representatives from the LSE SU. So you've got post-it notes, some big post-it notes here, and we've put some around the room if you prefer to stand up and note things down on a post-it note, and I think we've also set up a Padlet, so you can use the Padlet if you're online. Chris, I didn't say we were using Padlet. And you can use the Padlet if you're sitting in the room, if you want to open up the link. We're about to share it on the screen. And so as I said, you've got 10 minutes, form a group, we'll share some pens, and then we'll see what we've come up with. So thank you, everybody. I realise that you have been trying to scratch the surface, but maybe, well, to try and keep on schedule, we can at least hear a bit of feedback on each of the questions. I note that my colleague Jenny has reprimanded me because this is one of the beautiful writable whiteboards that have been installed across the LSE. So don't do what I do, which is suggest people fill up big post-it notes, use the writable whiteboards. Okay, so there's some really interesting comments on the Padlet. We will be sharing the Padlet after the session. We'll write up the comments that you put on your post-it notes, and do continue to click through to the Padlet link and have a look and share your ideas. But let's just get a couple of ideas from the room, and then if colleagues online are open and willing to be de-anonymized, unanonymize themselves, we could bring in a couple of people from our online community as well. So who wants to share what you thought you understood by student voice? Let's have some positive volunteers, you know, those students that we all really like in class who answer the first question. Thank you, great.
Okay.
Do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah. Firstly, my name is Selwyn Marcinuk. I'm first-year student, LLB in laws, academic representatives and department representative. So literally a small piece of academic, of students' voice in this case. And I must say, in my opinion, the idea of academic representatives is really good. It's efficient because it allows to consolidate the student and gather the feedback. I like the survey. They have good data to show, but the biggest problem is the survey doesn't allow to go really deep into the problem and understand why it is. Like, it's only made signal about the problem, but not provide the background of this problem. While representatives may reach people, and obviously students more open to their peers than to the academics professor, because they may be a bit shy to talk to professor. But yeah, they're more open, and as a result, academic representatives may go deeper, interview, understand, and find the real reason behind this, and sometimes even address, shape it in the diplomatic way, address it to the university, and also to the appropriate person, because each person has their field of expertise and field of responsibilities, and it's one of the parts of the academic representatives to do so. Regarding what is the most important for students,
maybe we can can I pause you there, because we'll hear from other people, but I think those are really valuable points, that survey data can be quite superficial, doesn't give a chance to go into great depth, might give you some broad data, but not quite as sort of delving into the reasons behind, and an academic representative can provide that bridging role between the student population and the department or the centre school. So thank you very much. Stuart, quick response from you.
Well, in our group, we were talking about there being a spectrum of voice through to participation in decision-making. And the staff-student liaison committees were very good in terms of holding to account to a set standard and making some suggested changes, but students have a huge demand for participation in decision-making around the design of their learning, and that's where it becomes much more challenging to create responsive structures.
Great, so thank you. So I think actually Dylan may be sharing with us some interesting frameworks about that sort of spectrum that you're talking about from the higher education literature in his presentation, that there's different opportunities and different modes of student voice and student engagement. Okay, so to keep us on track, I'm going to just turn to colleagues online and ask if anyone's willing to unmute themselves and tell us what you thought about closing that feedback loop. How do we deal with the fact that actually perhaps we have a load of information, but what we're not doing very well is analysing that information and then feeding back why we're making changes or why we're not making changes or why we want to get more information. So, you know, it's that sort of 10th to borrow survey that students have filled out at the end of the term and they don't know what it's gone into the black hole. So anyone online willing to be bold and make this a truly hybrid event? Raise your hand now or unmute yourself. Don't be shy. Help us to make this hybrid.
Hi, sorry, I can't raise my hand. Hello. Hi. I was going to say, yeah, that is obviously a massive challenge because, as somebody said on the Padlet, it's like obviously it's pretty important to tell them what we can't do as well, because there's all this expectation of, you know, a student wants that, they want A, B, C. What can we do? But sometimes there isn't anything we can do, but it's important to say that we can't and the reasons why, but to make it clear that, you know, we're trying, that's the important thing. It's that we will do things where we can, but where we can't, we'll make it clear as to why we can't. So I have no kind of easy answer for this. And also I kind of think that things we've done in the past, like you said we did, it's kind of difficult to, like, you know, you put it on plasma screens and stuff, but where kind of do students actually see that? Does it make a difference? I think it's quite a difficult kind of nut to crack, as it were. So I don't really know what the honest answer to that is, but I do think it's important that, as you said, Clay, you don't forget the kind of feedback and it doesn't just like go into the ether and that's it. So, yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. I think those are really valuable points. You know, what is actually the best mode of communication for students? And we've got comms experts in the room and online, I think, for making sure that when we're trying to communicate back our responses to feedback, that we get it into the right hands. David, do you want to add something?
I was just going to say, I agree with Sarah's point completely, but I wonder if there's something around like illustrating our values at all times, so that even students get feedback which they may not like, or we can't do A, B, and C, but if people understand the values that you're working towards at all times, then at least people will be like, I at least understand where you're coming from in the best instance.
Yeah, thanks. So that's a sort of sense of shared values, shared principles that underpin our community, which builds trust as a starting point, rather than that sort of something that it feels oppositional potentially that Emma was referring to. Anyone else want to suggest something that they've done or that have worked well for them in closing that feedback loop? Great.
Vanessa. So from lecture one, this year I'm lecturing on a new course that didn't exist. And from lecture one, I created this anonymous portal where students can send comments. But the feedback is weekly, so if they're posting on it, in the next lecture I'm addressing everything that has been posted before, whether it is something that can be done or can't be done, but with a feeling that I will report back, and so they will be read. It is completely anonymous, and students then see what each other have posted. And it's works sometimes really well, sometimes, now that it's week 10, it's dying.
Everyone's tired.
Yeah.
But you found in a way that it's created a dialogue between you and your students?
Yeah. And it's been anything from, you know, they wanted summative feedback, which clearly this year is not happening because it's not how the course is set up. But there was a feeling that things will be read and will be communicated to the right people. And some of it was really nice, like lectures that they liked, class teachers that were doing a great job and things like that.
Right. So can we ask what tool you're using? Okay,
So it's an online anonymous post box. I tried Padlet. Sorry. They didn't like it. So the idea that they could see what the others were posting didn't fly at all. They just wanted full anonymity.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that's interesting to hear. Good. So that, I'm sorry we couldn't hear back from more of you, but we will feed back to you based on the post-it notes and also Padlet. But now I want to hand over to our, we're joined today from two colleagues from the LSE Students' Union, our SU Education Officer, Maria Robani, and also Ricardo what's his name?
Vizinho.
Vizinho, I was going to say Vizinho, so I've got the S wrong. Vizinho, who's head of student voice, what could be more appropriate? I'm going to start with Maria.
Hi everyone, my name is Maria Ravani. I am the Education Officer at the Students' Union. So I guess just reflecting on the warm-up activity and the theme for today's, or this term's Education Forum, I'd like to share some of my experiences, both as a former master's student in the Department of Government, but now also in my current role as a staff officer for education. And maybe some of these reflections hopefully resonate with folks in the room. But I guess to get things started, I think it's worthwhile mentioning just how the way in which we see student voice versus the way in which we feel student voice in some of these spaces as a student are two very different things. And I think, in my view at least, that some of this disconnect stems from the perception that student voice is this concept or a thing that only panders to bureaucracy. By that I mean when you're invited as a student rep to high-level meetings without your voice carrying the same weight as your colleagues, sometimes this actually perpetuates or exacerbates the problem of the feedback loop and student voice concerns. So I guess in my experience, what I've learned is that there's quite a number of strong lobbies at LSE, and sometimes that can overshadow the recommendations and concerns raised by students. But obviously, you know, when they do incorporate some of these views, it's good practice. And maybe controversially, like this also goes back to the idea that the fact that universities must have a student union because the 1994 Education Act requires them to do so, but the Act does not enforce students or universities to act on the feedback received by students, also adds to this disjuncture. So when we talk about closing the feedback loop without really addressing this accountability factor on the senior management or departmental front, it does lead to a lot of anger and frustration for students who, you know, only see their program or national survey as the outlet to express some of this dissatisfaction. And, you know, I don't think that by saying this, you know, we're disempowering students from speaking out, but actually the opposite. I think that, or at least I hope that it evokes some kind of collective anger amongst students and amongst people in this room to kind of act on this. Because just like in the teach outs on Friday, I mean, there was a student campaigner who touched on the words of Audre Lorde on the sense of the uses of anger and how we're reminded that this sense of using anger can help to spotlight areas for improvement. And I quote, you know, corrective surgery, not guilt, because guilt and defensiveness are bricks in a wall in which we all flounder. They serve none of our futures. So I guess to end on a more slightly positive note, what I will say is that in this year and in the last year, in terms of student involvement and student engagement within LSE, we are noticing a positive trend as, you know, student voice as a practice of agency, and then and this agency that I've experienced and I've seen in committee meetings and boards and so on looks like speaking out or, you know, sharing a different view and sort of challenging normative or status quo ideas at the LSE, but it also looks like active campaigning. It looks like submitting motion proposals to the SU, looks like signing petitions and open letters, and even through hunger striking, which is a more radical approach, obviously, to expressing anger, but it's done ultimately to spark some kind of change and to challenge some of these outdated and archaic LSE policies. And I guess with that, I'd like to hand over to Ricardo, who is our head of student voice and who's worked at the SU for several years and was also an undergraduate student from the same department as me. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Marion. And despite my job title, I can assure you I do not know as much about student voice as you might think. First, thank you for inviting me. And I think my first instinct when I was invited to speak here was actually to question whether I should.
And that's because I'm not a student and I can't speak to the student experience. But then I thought, as Mario touched upon, I was once a student here many years ago, and I have been working here for several years, so maybe I might have something, hopefully, of value to add. But for me, in short, I was thinking about this, and I think student voice for me is about three things. One is creating platforms where students are given a voice. Two is about breaking down barriers that prevent some students from exercising their voice or being listened to. And three, ensuring that structurally and culturally, when students do speak up, that their voices are not just heard, but genuinely valued and acted upon. So I think if we sort of take these in turn, I think the first one, creating platforms, I think you can almost look at that and think, well, actually, on the face of it, LSE is actually doing okay. You know, you've got students on governance committees, you've got regular meetings between LSE and the student unions, sabbatical officers, you've got the fantastic work that happens at Eden Centre with the student education panel and change makers. You've got an academic rep structure and consultative forum which involves hundreds of students. So on the surface, they're all looking good. But do students genuinely have a voice in all of these? Do all students have a voice? Do all students have access to these platforms? So we'll come on to that in a bit, in a while. The second point is about barriers. So I think it's important to bear in mind that not all students arrive at LSE or any educational institution with the same level of confidence to speak up or to exercise their voice. We were talking about in our group a while ago, sort of the term imposter syndrome is one which is quite familiar to most of us. And some of that may come from who people are and their personal experiences, but often it's also due to historic and systemic biases that certain demographics have experienced and continue to experience. Therefore, if we're serious about student voice, it's important to build in structures which break down those barriers, particularly for students from marginalised communities. So that's the key challenge for me. It's not just create those platforms, but what are the proactive steps that we're going to take to encourage, include, and build confidence for all students, and especially those who might otherwise not find it. And actually in the Student Union we're doing something a bit interesting through a democracy review that we had, where we reviewed our democratic structures and sort of using bodies of students selected by random sortition to be demographically representative of the student body and putting them in positions of key accountability structure positions and deciding on which policies are put forward. And I'm happy to talk separately to anyone who's interested in that. But the final point really is there's no point building platforms and breaking down barriers if those voices aren't then going to be heard or felt to be heard. And I think there's a couple of challenges that LSE has that makes that difficult. So firstly, LSE is a very hierarchical institution, so there are many, many layers between students and the upper echelons of LSE. So that makes it difficult for genuine student voice to be considered. So in some institutions, you've got the equivalent of the director or the vice-chancellor meeting regularly with the president of the student union or in a general secretary. That doesn't happen at LSE. You've also got many layers of bureaucracy. So you've got several governance committees where key decisions are made on the future of LSE. But often you've got some reps, some student reps on some committees, but when they attend these, they're not given too much in the way of supporting them to have an authentic voice on there. And they're often surrounded by people who don't look like them, who are several generations older than them, and that's scary and intimidating. What are we doing to really sort of break down those barriers? And then there's departmental autonomy, which is a particular characteristic of LSE. Now that may bring about some innovation and some good practice, but it also brings about inequity in terms of how student voice is heard across the LSE. And that's a challenge which I don't think we've quite made. So for me, at best, student voice is not just about giving students a platform, but taking a genuine interest in what they have to say. And crucially, that doesn't mean agreeing with everything, not least because students aren't a monolith. But it does mean valuing what they have to say and taking steps to respond or act upon it when they do. So if we're serious about improving student voice, I think that when those issues and challenges are difficult to hear, especially when they're difficult to hear, there needs to be a willingness to listen and to take that on board and to act. So that's the challenge for me. How do we create platforms where students are given a voice? How do we break down barriers that prevent some students from exercising their voice and or being listened to? And how do we ensure that structurally and culturally, when students do speak up, that their voices aren't just heard, but genuinely valued and acted upon? I think if we get that right, we will have an ability to spot and resolve issues much earlier on. We'll bring dynamism and innovation because we've got a bright bunch here, and the turnover is every year for most students because they're postgrad, and we'll have an improved student experience. And I think final point I'd end this on is that actually an improved student experience isn't just good for students, it's good for LSE. Thank you.
We could call those presentations calls to action, and maybe we can come back, depending on our research, which we're about to hear from our colleagues in the Eden Centre. Maybe if there's a bit of time at the end, we can take questions on your presentations, because I feel we haven't done them justice, and the research coming out of the Eden Centre, which I think you'll hear echoes in a lot of what you've said. And I also noticed sort of in the Padlet there were several people commenting on, you know, whose student voices are heard and silenced voices, marginalised voices. So I think that's really important too. And then that sort of performative dimension. I think we've all sat in committee meetings where students have been very well included and their voices being called on, and other meetings where students have felt more like tokenism rather than genuine members of the particular meeting group. So I think there's lots of good food for thought coming out of your presentation. Of course, we need to design what we do collectively. So what I want to do now is I'm going to hand over to colleagues in the Eden Centre who've been undertaking research on different aspects of student voice and community. We're going to start with Akile and Sarah. Akile will introduce Sarah, and then we'll move to our colleagues who've been working on student partnership. So over to you, Akile and Sarah. Yeah, come over and stand over here.
Right, thank you. Sorry, I'm still very much full of cold, so apologies for my voice. So my name is Akile, for those of you that don't know me, but I think I know most people. So I'm Head of Inclusive Education, and Sarah Garon is our intern for Inclusive Education. And we're going to be talking to you very briefly, because we've only got a short amount of time, about our work on inclusive education, and specifically a project that's been running now for over a year, looking at higher education identities. So we've spoken a lot about student voice, and what I wanted to do with the inclusive education work is to work alongside students and to gain an idea of what it means to be a student at LSE across your time. Okay, so we wanted something around temporality, but we didn't want to survey our students. So we adopted quite an intense autobiographical research project that involved 15 undergraduate and postgraduate students using autobiographical methods, using a diary method, using interviews with them. And we were really surprised by the uptake of this research. We had over 300 students want to take part in the project, which I was very much surprised by, because it was such an intense piece of work, but we could only work with 15 students. And we really wanted to think about student identities rather than this idea of a student just a monolithic on its own, just a student. Can you go to the next slide? So, and some of this kind of stems from me being a geographer and community and belonging being really key to the work that I do. But also we have seen quite a lot of work across the sector talking about community, talking about belonging, and these are just, I just did a very quick Google search to see what other universities had out there, and you can see, sorry, they're not the most accessible slides, but you will see there's either this singular student community that they target, or there's an element of pluralism where we've got student communities, and I was quite surprised by the University of Essex breakdown of the way they view the different communities that are in the university. So we actually wanted to think about the power of kind of unpacking community and belonging for our students. And I'm going to hand over to Sarah to talk you through the research and how student voice sort of fits into that, and then we'll talk you through some of our findings.
Yeah, so if we can go to the next slide, please. I apologise for how quick this is going to be, but this was our research question. So it all stems from the Inclusive Education Action Plan, which is what Akile works on in the Eden Centre, and it's part of the Developing Higher Education Identity. So yeah, we were looking essentially at how do students at LSE narrativise, conceptualise and locate their class self during their time at LSE, at university. And if we can change to the next slide, it was guided by some very condensed aims and principles. But if we start from the left, we really did want to centralise the student voice and experience. So letting students define themselves, which is why we looked for qualitative research, and let them tell us how their identities are relevant to their experience here. We wanted to understand how LSE structures and practices produce disparate student experiences, and obviously understanding what we can change to make the experience better, and to go beyond kind of tick boxes and quotas to make sure that all students not only feel but also actually thrive as valued, represented and respected members of the community. And I guess the three kind of central principles of our work was to avoid predefined identity categories and questions. So moving away from surveys, we made sure with the diary entries, with the interviews, that students could actually not only define their own kind of categories and identities that was relevant to them, but didn't kind of have to fit within what we assumed would be relevant. We recognised that identity was fluid, multiple and intersectional, and that obviously students from categorised groups won't all have the same experience at LSE, and we wanted to make sure that it was co-created, so very much student-led. We had some training sessions at the start, and the dialogue was really consistent throughout the year to make sure that, again, students can create their own narrative around identities and allow them to tell their own stories on their own terms. This is a rough timeline. It's obviously extended now. There are a few changes of researchers. I'm actually the third that's worked on the project. But it did start, this is 2021, so it started at the start of 2021. As Akile said, we had, I think, over 350 participants sign up. We narrowed it down to 15. We had training sessions with a lot of dialogue, feedback, input from students. It was a first interview, and diary entries continued throughout the 3 terms. We had a final interview at the end, and I've worked mainly now on the data analysis and finding ways to code the data and come up and go to the next slide. Oh, no, okay. I changed the slide order personally, but I'll show you the findings later. This is actually a breakdown of our demographics. So obviously it's important for us to be transparent about the kind of demographics of our participants. So it's slightly unclear with Zoom, but we had 3 undergraduate first years, 3 undergraduate second years, 4 third years, and 4 postgraduate fourths, or 5 third years, so I can count. 7 international, 8 homes, 7 different departments, and age range between 18 and 27, obviously. More bunched towards the younger end of that as well. And if we can go to the next slide, this is also a rough breakdown of what the students said in our kind of intro survey. So the left column, if it isn't clear, is yes. So 3 said yes to being caregivers, to having experienced care, estrangement or homelessness, to have disability or health conditions. And between 15 students, I think quite impressively, we had 9 nationalities, 15 ethnicities, 10 primary languages, and a few different data that I haven't put down on here. But our hope is that obviously it's a small sample size, but that we captured somehow quite a large range of experiences with the project. And so if we can go to the next slide, this is our kind of initial themes that have come out. We'll obviously speak today about belonging in the community, but there are some really interesting findings in all of these that have come out from the research so far.
How long do we have, Claire?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So these are some of the key themes. Sorry, Sarah, I've distracted you. But we wanted to really talk to you, if you can go to the next slide, please, about this notion of belonging. Because belonging is political, right? It's not kind of the way that we're framing it in HE. It encompasses citizenship, gender, ethnicity, status, and it's also about an attachment to space and place, right? So if we're in an institution, how do we belong to this university when we're only here for a short amount of time as a student? Temporality was really key to some of our findings, and also the complexities of intersectionality. So what we're saying is what we've found through these narratives, which I don't think we have time to read out, but please do read them as I speak, is that if we talk about belonging through this notion of educational purpose, that could be something that we could tap into. And I've been thinking a lot about the TEF and this notion of educational gain, actually, and how do we, and we can see from these narratives as well, I have a certain degree of belongingness, but I would say that is to my department rather than the whole university. That's not necessarily a bad thing, to feel that kinship towards your department or to your discipline or to your scholarship. If you can go to the next slide, please. And again, this notion of community also was about this shared purpose, this idea of scholarship, this idea of coming here to work hard, Yes, that has problems associated with it, but actually I think that by trying to do all the things that the universities are doing, like let's do this, let's try and get them in here, it's too much in my opinion anyway. And what we found from the students is they want to come here, they want to learn, and can we capture that through this notion of community and learning? And that's the discussion. But if you would like to hear more, in the Lent term, Sarah and I will be facilitating a series of workshops that will talk through our findings. So please do come along to those workshops. Shameless plug, but thank you, Sarah.
As you can see, there's a rich vein of data coming out of this research project, which covers the whole life cycle of the student journey. So thank you for keeping to time. Now I'm going to invite Lydia, who's our student partnership coordinator, to introduce Dylan and his research.
Hopefully many of you will know that in the Eden Centre our work on student partnership primarily focuses on change makers and the student education panel, which are two partnership initiatives delivered at the school level. But a lot of work goes into finding ways to support colleagues across the school to kind of embed a culture of partnership in their own interactions with students, whether that's in the classroom or through the delivery of professional services. So 6 months ago we were really pleased to get some funding from Careers for Dylan's graduate internship role, and we've been conducting research into how students understand and experience partnership at LSE, and I hope some of the findings are going to be interesting and relevant to you.
Thanks, Lydia. Thank you. So I'll also be as brief as possible. A lot of what I shared today will be findings that could echo things that were shared by previous speakers. So we have some findings today from the research that I conducted. These were 5 focus groups with a total of, I think, about 22 students. Followed on from a review of literature, some sector-wide benchmarking of partnership activities at other UK universities, and internal mapping of partnership practices at LSE. So we go to the next slide, please. So student partnership has been argued to form stronger learning communities within higher education institutions. On this model here with the circles, this is by Healy, Flint, and Harrington. They centralize the idea of learning communities as an outcome of their sort of model of different partnership practices. On the other end, in terms of student voice, as you can see on this sort of ladder here, partnership is one of the sort of higher forms of student engagement that comes after student consultation, which would be part of a student voice program. So the research that I conducted confirms these claims, but it also actually reveals the essential importance of student voice work and a strong sense of community as an essential prerequisite for successful partnership practice, particularly for students who feel quite unengaged and disconnected. Simultaneously, student partnership is a complementary to student voice, but it's by nature a more demanding form of student engagement, and it is fulfilling a different function entirely. We argue that actually one of the benefits of student partnership in comparison to student voice are its unique learning outcomes. Can we go to the next slide, please? So similar to what Sarah and Akile shared, students in my focus groups definitely view the understanding of LSE's communities from their departments. This actually comes from a first-year undergraduate student, so within a month they've already become aware of the fact that LSE is very individuated by its departments. Go to the next slide. So students tended to understand how they could get support and representation through the university in 2 sort of separate ways. The department ones will notice are much more targeted and individualized, which of course makes sense. And then there's this more nebulous idea of the school itself that the student in that quote before mentioned. This would include things like the Student Services Centre, the SU, the Disability Wellbeing Services. So if you go to the next slide, please. So as a result, student understandings of their community were very much divergent. Some had very strong and deep attachments to their departments, whereas others actually felt alienated or even afraid of staff members in their departments. For those who already felt quite engaged, student partnership was both seen as a logical outcome and, a logical continuation and a desirable outcome of that relationship. So these quotes sort of illustrate how the students have been thinking about their relationships with their departments. This has a lot of importance for partnership work. Students will be working with staff as an inherent aspect of it, and students who might find those previous channels that I mentioned lacking they find partnership working desirable, but they found it also kind of incredulous. They were hesitant about how they might even approach or discuss with staff members. Go to the next slide. In addition, there was also this idea recurring of a culture of competitiveness among students within their own departments. And that led to concerns about partnership being essentially a closed circle of opportunities, kind of like what Emma mentioned at the beginning, highly engaged students and highly engaged staff working with one another continuously without much outreach to the wider communities. So as a result, the learning communities at LSE, depending on how strong and cohesive they are, those that are relatively weak will sort of essentially cap the impact of what student partnership activity will do within that department. If we go to the next slide, please. Some positive news, though, is that changemakers and the student education panels have been shown to have very positive outcomes for both student voice and LSE's learning communities. Those who had participated in both of those programs felt a significantly stronger sense of community, which they were able to identify and locate much more clearly. If you go to the next slide as well, interdepartmentalism was particularly found as a highlight of both of these programs. Not just to deepen their understanding of the community at LSE, but also to encourage them to problem solve in ways they would not have otherwise thought to do so. If you go to the next slide. So students who hadn't participated in these programs and were new to the idea of student partnership did see it as something that would improve their sense of community, particularly in forming relationships with staff and gaining greater agency over their learning and institution. Go to the next slide. So both of these findings do confirm the claims made in this model by Healy, Flynn, and Harrington, where student partnership has actually improved the community at LSE successfully, especially where students might be otherwise quite atomized. But at the same time, the students who did gain the most from these opportunities and that were applying for them were already sort of attached to a community, were often SLC reps or academic reps, or they already considered themselves to be highly engaged, highly motivated, often very high-performing students. So the partnership work needs to exist in tandem with some other student voice and community building practices if it's really going to be that wide-ranging and successful. So go to the next slide. So generally, students did find it difficult to distinguish student partnership from student voice. And by this I mean a consultation of student opinion rather than more engaged forms of working with staff members. Even after being presented with definitions of student partnership, and even students who had participated in Changemakers and the student education panel, they often conflated the two. And this showed me that the way in which partnership is communicated to students is very important, not only to distinguish it as its own practice, but to ensure that students understand what its purpose and the nature of its outcomes are going to be. Where students were given greater clarity about this, they were much more positive in terms of their reactions towards partnership working. Presently, the two main programs, Changemakers and the SEP, can be thought of as essentially more engaged forms of student voice. They involve consulting students about school-wide issues for their particular expertise and their ability to facilitate changes they might want to see. But they offer, in fact, different outcomes for students and different values than other student voice opportunities would. Students often will raise concerns, which have been echoed all throughout today already, about authenticity and reciprocity. And partnership actually is an opportunity to sort of make clear those outcomes and actualize that, not just by communicating to students what their work has achieved, but because students are gaining new skills, knowledge, a transformed relationship with their institution, and distinct learning outcomes. So in particular, I'd like to argue that the pedagogical benefits of student partnership are quite underplayed at present. Changemakers in the SCP actually provides students with educational benefits that student voice doesn't necessarily, nor is it actually intending to. Students are much more able to understand the teaching, learning, and research process and develop deep learning skills through partnership work. Go to the next slide. This actually was highlighted as well from the lack of a clear relationship between the work done by Lydia on Changemakers in the SCP and other partnership work going across the school. There's certainly a lack of cohesion among colleagues sharing best practice. And so finally, students are very aware of their special status of how they can make changes to their university. They are both paying clients, increasingly paying higher fees. We expect a service, therefore, to be of a very high quality, as well as a distinct body with its own perspective to contribute. Regardless on how we might feel about the way in which students are now seen as paying clients, this is how they perceive themselves vis-a-vis their university, at least in one way, and it's going to affect their openness towards partnership opportunities, particularly as it affects their degree program. So I think having a strong foundation of proactive, again, authentic and reciprocal student voice work within strong and supportive communities will demonstrate to students the value of their contributions, not just financially. And partnership working is a complement to and extension of these practices with its own educational benefits to the students.
Thank you, Dylan. We don't really have time to have questions, I'm afraid, because we're going to keep on track. But I think what this shows is that we're trying, in different parts of the school, the Eden Centre, elsewhere in the school, to really work in partnership with our students to understand their experience in the university better, so that we can then design and develop really genuine approaches to making student voice more than just a slogan that comes out of the Office for Students, and we are to be held to account for through the TEF. And I think that we've got these incredibly rich seams of data which can really help move us in that direction, and we're very grateful, I think, to the students who have contributed to this work so generously. So we've heard about some research findings, we've heard about concerns, about kind of what we mean by student voice, how inclusive really is the student voice that we're talking about in the LSE community. And now we're going to hear from the departments. We've got three representatives from a range of different departments across the school: geography and environment, government and social policy, and they're going to share with us their good practice, how they seek to engage students through community building, and in particular with the lens of student voice. So I'd like to introduce Thomas Smith, who's from the Department of Geography and Environment, and he's going to present us how it looks from Geography and Environment.
I'll try my best.
Yeah.
So I should say I'm presenting today on behalf of fantastic PSS team that we have in our department, who are responsible for most of the initiatives that I'm going to talk about. Very briefly, I'll keep it short and sweet. I've structured this based on the continuum of voice. So kind of starting off with students that are able to express themselves, us consulting with students, but then moving towards some of the more complex types of student voice activities where students become, where it's student-driven activities rather than the educator-driven initiatives. I'm going to start with simple things that are very quick and easy for you to install if you haven't got one in your department yet. This is a suggestion box in our undergraduate common room. There's slips of paper here saying, tell us what you think. And we've also got above that the you said, we did kind of information here. Simple things like we want communal study space within the department. So we refurbished this room, made sure there were some nice tables and chairs available. Tea and coffee. We wanted fair trade tea and coffee. And so, simple things I think can be really important to some students, particularly those that use the common rooms frequently. So I guess that's students able to express themselves anonymously, but we also have the anonymous post box as well that goes out every week to our students in our student newsletter. So the student newsletter goes out on a Monday, and at the end of the newsletter is this link, send anonymous feedback suggestions. Again, very quick and easy way to enable your students to provide, express their opinions. We do surveys as well beyond Tiquaro. So every event that we organise in the department, from a drinks reception to the photography competition to staff versus students football match to our field trips, which are either optional or linked to some of the courses that we run. For every single one of those activities, we run a survey that goes out with a permalink, so the permalink can be shared by email. It can also be shown on the screen in the lecture. And I'll also talk a little bit more towards the end about how we get such high engagement with our surveys. It's mainly thanks to the spies that we have in their WhatsApp groups, but I'll come on to that in a minute. But essentially, these are all MS forms, and everything goes. And the PSS team know a lot more about this than I do, but the results auto feed into a SharePoint Excel dashboard, and you get to see these green and yellow. I think green means good, and generally we see lots of those. Something else that you might not be aware you can do with Outlook is these quick polls. This is just something, again, consulting with our students. Would you prefer the welcome week orientation to be be split into separate undergraduate and postgraduate sessions. This year, and for the past few years, we've always run them together, but we wanted to check with our undergraduates whether they would appreciate a session separated so that there isn't so many people in the room. And again, this just pops up in their email. They just click an option, press send, and it goes straight into an Excel spreadsheet. But I think this is where we do really well. I mean, geography lends itself well to trips. It's now part of the LSE offer, though. We're trying to encourage all departments to think about a trip, especially in the first year. This is a photograph from our first year trip. It normally runs at the end of week 3 or the end of this year. We ran at the end of week 5. In Michaelmas term, we take all 90 students out of London to do activities that relate to their core programmes in their first year. And I really like the point that was put up on the Padlet by someone. All interaction with students is an example of student voice in action, and I think that's the case. And if you can increase the interactions between your staff and your students in any way, then it's only going to improve the perception of the students and of the availability of staff to listen to them. So the wonderful thing with trips, this is 2 nights, 2 days. So the students and staff are interacting with each other extensively, both during the activities on the trip, but also in the mornings at breakfast, in the evenings at dinner, and then sometimes you walk down the pub, or we have a film screening as well for students who don't want to go to the pub. So plenty of opportunities for those kind of long form activities to enable students to interact with staff. And the good thing is we reinforce that in the second year, where we go on with an 8-day trip, usually with all of our students, different destinations depending on the programme that they're on. And again, 8 days with members of staff who are teaching them in their second year and will be teaching them in their third year. It's a great opportunity for us to learn from them about their experience of our programme. And I think that's probably the most important way that we understand how our students are thinking about our courses and our programmes, is through going on these trips and interacting with students this way. About partnership and moving up the continuum of voice, we run within department research fellowships, a little bit similar to the Changemakers programme. We actually have 18 positions this year. Bearing in mind we only have 90 students, so there's a lot of student participation. Over the 3 years, it's possible for one in 2 of our students to do one of these. Not all of these most of these projects are students working with staff on research projects, so basically research assistants. But some of the projects are becoming increasingly geared towards students looking at the curriculum. This year we have 2 students looking at decolonising the curriculum, analysing reading lists across all of our courses in the whole department. And we also have students who are editors of our new Journal of Geography and Environment journal, which is part of LSE Houghton Street Press. Little things like this every week. We have lunchtime with a geographer or lunchtime with an academic. We had to rename it so we could apply for the same pot of money again. To pay for pizza. But again, what you see here is a professor. Everyone's eating pizza, they're talking to each other, inevitably conversations turn to teaching, learning, assessment, and I think we learn a lot from students in these informal settings, as well as the SSLC. So to finish with, we have a really large SSLC, so we actually have 15 to 20 reps in each year group, so that might seem like it's too many people to fit into a room, but as you're probably aware from your own SSLCs, lots of students don't come. So by having lots of representatives from each year on all of the programmes, we hopefully have at least one from each year coming to each meeting. But the most important thing is they're all part of this WhatsApp group. So this is WhatsApp group undergraduate SSLC 2021-2022. The membership of that is 55 students, and therefore they don't all need to come to the meeting because they're already exchanging all their ideas of what they want to bring up in the meetings in the WhatsApp group. And we have a PSS member of staff who is part of that WhatsApp group as well. We use WhatsApp for organising all of our field trips. It's the only way to get students to wake up and come to breakfast in the morning. So this is the Juniper Hall 2022 WhatsApp group. We did a quiz one night and someone requested the music round, so I shared that with them. But here you go, the next day, or 2 weeks later, we'd appreciate it if you could spend 2 minutes to give us your feedback, and then we'll post a link to that further link feedback sheet that I showed you earlier. But the WhatsApp groups are really fantastic with every student teams. And that's it.
It's really great to see that sort of continuum from the starting with what you said we did all the way up to.
I promised Giles I'll say one more thing. Just very quickly, sorry, but activism is another form of student voice, and we've already heard that today. And we had activism in our department last year from our second year students who didn't want to do in-person exams. And that was a really difficult situation for us. The vast majority of them put in a petition. We negotiated, we had a town hall event. Not everyone was going to be happy with the outcome, but we met somewhere halfway, and they ended up having 24-hour online exams. But it's important to recognise there were some students who weren't happy with that decision. And I think the reason why I'm here is because we did quite well in NSS last year, and I'm just putting that out there because this year group of the next NSS group who are not particularly happy with it.
I think that sort of sense that activism can have positive outcomes, and also not everybody sees things the same way. It's all part of this complex picture. Delighted to welcome Kate Jessup from the Department of Government, who's going to share with us the view from government. See, you've got your slides. Yeah, thank you, Kate.
We were just getting them ready.
This is a direct result of my inability to plan in advance for sending us. Is that shared with the Zoom as well?
I'm just about to. So, one of you up, please.
So, hi everyone, I'm Kate from the Department of Government. I'm the Deputy Department Manager in the department. My role focuses very much on, amongst other things, developing the student experience and looking at ways that we can give students voice within that activity. So obviously I'll give a brief overview of the department, and particularly I'm going to talk about our undergraduate students today and share some of the initiatives that we have implemented that we think have impacted on an increase in our NSS scores. So who are our students? So we have about 850 students across the department. 500 of those are undergraduate students. We're in, I think, a bit of a particular situation in our department where, although we have 500 undergrad students only studying across 6 programs, only one of those programs is solely owned by the department, the others are all joint programs. So thinking about how we give students voice within the department, I think we've touched on quite a few of these areas already today, but we try and give students opportunities to give feedback about their programs. So that's obviously SSLCs. We have other initiatives too, which I'll talk to as we go through. Give students opportunities to work with staff and discuss the feedback in more detail, and look at initiatives that we can build as a consequence of that, and how that feedback feeds into broader strategies that we're looking at developing within the department. And then to try and show the students that feedback to us that we act on that feedback and that we take it seriously, and that there's something that kind of builds from that feedback. So, what are these initiatives that we have in place? I think over the years we've tried lots of different things. In terms of that, giving opportunities for feedback, obviously we have SSLCs, we run those at all levels of study. And they're a great way of getting some feedback about some areas of study, some initiatives that we run in terms of student experience. But what it doesn't necessarily do, and what you possibly can't see here at the top of the slide there, is that it doesn't engage with all students. It's getting feedback that is filtered through representatives. So what we've done over the past few years is to run town halls. They were particularly useful through the pandemic, as there was a constant changing of information and constant kind of shifting of sands for departments and for the school in general. But it was a way for us to get instant feedback from the students, to really get a sense of their opinions about particular problems that we were facing as a school, how to run assessment through the pandemic, what hybrid teaching might look like, and for us as a department to give instant feedback to them there. So kind of opening and closing the feedback loop in one fell swoop. We have tried really hard to bring student voice into our governance structures. So that is having student representatives on all of our department committees. So they give voice and give the student voice on education, research, EDI, and student engagement as well. Obviously that to some extent empowers students to feed into the decisions that are shaping the way that we run the department. And again, it's another mechanism for closing the feedback loop. So feedback that comes through the student, the SSLCs, then gets fed into the teaching committee. The students see that that is being discussed and considered, and they feed that back through into the SSLCs in the next meeting. Another thing that we've done over the past few years is to run focus groups, particularly linked to the development of our department education strategy. But focus groups run at each level of study throughout undergrad, and also one for students who identify as BAME. We run those in collaboration with colleagues from the Eden Centre, and it's really to understand the lived experience of students within the department, and to get feedback that informs the development of the education strategy. One example of that was that students felt that there wasn't necessarily a coherence between what we offered at second year versus the courses we offered at third year, and so we're trying now to develop pathways through our second and third year courses to bring some coherence into the education offering within the department. And finally, something that we've done in terms of partnering with students is to create a student engagement strategy. So this is a document that is still in development, but it is created for students, by students. So we employed student research assistants, we had a graduate intern who ran the project, and really tried to give a sense of, or guide how we attempt to build community, to give voice to students, and to communicate more effectively with our students. So this strategy is, like I said, developed in partnership with students. It's also overseen by the Student Engagement Committee within the department, so it feeds into and has interaction with academic staff, PSS staff, and students as well. And we really feel that that empowers students to be involved both with the creation of the strategy itself, but then as we go through, hopefully that they'll see iterations of it and that they'll be involved in the improvement stage as well. So not just giving feedback in terms of what we already do that we can do better, but being there right at the beginning too. And most helpfully for me, certainly, is that it gives us a whole load of really practical things that we can take forward in terms of how we address some of the concerns that were raised as we went through the development of the strategy. And then last but not least, we have to put some of our success down to luck, to chance. Particularly this year, we received, I think we touched on it there in terms of the response to moving from online assessment back to in-person assessment. We had a particularly vocal group of students who contacted us through Twitter, and also through a survey that they then sent the results to us. We kind of ummed and ahed a little bit about how to respond to that, but decided to engage with the students who had contacted us to really try and understand their concerns. And as a department, we decided that actually probably the best solution for our students was to move back to online assessment. I think we did that quite quickly. I think we were also really lucky that all of that decision making happened right at the point when the NSS survey was released. And so, I think, yes, we can be really proud of some of the really strategic things that we've put in place and some of the initiatives that we're still carrying on, but we have to also bear in mind that all of that interacts with things that happen that we have to be pragmatic and respond to at the time. So if we can move on. So then thinking about how we measure the impact and the success of these initiatives. So here we've got the school level NSS scores for student voice. I think we can click on one more. The department level NSS scores on student voice. Both of them ticking along. We're making some slight improvements. I think as a department we recognise very clearly that we started at a lower level and we have more to do. But we're pleased that there is a slow and steady improvement in terms of how the actions that we are putting in place are being perceived. And we can click on. The problem is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have sort of 4/5 of our students on joint programmes, and so the responses that we get from these joint programmes when we drill down into programme level results are quite mixed. I think this shows us that, yes, although in general as a department we're doing okay, there's a lot more to do, particularly with joint programme students. But on our wholly owned programme, we're really quite pleased that we've seen some really impressive gains over the last year, and that's really bucking the trend of what we're seeing across the school. And I don't know whether we can make the correlation between kind of department-owned decisions and initiatives versus things where we have to work more collaboratively, but I think there's something to be said there about the improvements of the BSc Politics programme. And so what do we need to do now? What's next? We are fully aware that there's more to do, as our NSS scores show. I think I've highlighted the need for us to work more collaboratively with our joint programme department counterparts. What can we do in terms of making sure that all students on those programmes have a consistency of experience that we're able to provide within departments, and also to recognise that we don't work in silo, that we have to work collaboratively with other departments to ensure that student voice is, if it comes to us in one department, that it is passed on to all departments too. Other areas for us as a department, we're really keen to keep engaging with the findings of the work that is happening around the school. We don't necessarily do much enough yet in terms of engaging with programmes like Changemakers programme, with the SEP and the outputs that come from those. I think there's plenty more that we can do there. And then, I guess, embedding the practice that we have already. I think one of the things that came out for me as I was starting to think about this presentation was I could have done this really collaboratively and in partnership with a student, but there's no student with me today. And so thinking about making sure that every time that we do talk about the student experience, that we are involving students in that conversation too. And off the back of that, that we avoid tokenism when we're trying to get students to give their opinion, that when we ask them for their opinion, it's for a reason, and that we're not just doing it to tick a box to tick a box and complete the exercise, that we're really taking it as feedback to the department that we can act on or not, and explain why we can't act on this. That's it. I'll leave it there. That's great. Thank you.
And this was telling me today that over half our students in the school are on joint programmes, so it'd be actually interesting to see if that student voice replicates, that student voice data replicates the split between home department programmes and shared programmes. Okay, so we're now going to hand over, last but not least, to Leo Giliotis, who's from the Department of Social Policy, and is going to talk to us about student voice and closing the feedback loop in social policy.
Thank you, Claire. I do not have any slides, so I will hopefully keep your attention. So obviously there are many different ways in which we can give voice to our students. Students can arrange to have one-to-one meetings with academic mentors, or indeed group meetings with their academic mentors, their dissertation supervisors. If they want to, they can arrange to meet PS staff who can then, if appropriate, inform members of the academic staff accordingly. Students express their views through the dreaded surveys, MSS, PTT, TQR, all those things. But I would like to focus specifically in the remainder of my very brief presentation on two different means through which students can have their voices heard within my department. Program level SSLC meetings, and relatedly to those meetings, meetings with student representatives at teaching committee. So, like in other departments, we too in social policy have dedicated staff-student liaison committees for undergraduate students, for postgraduate students, taught postgraduate students, and for postgraduate research students, in other words, PhDs. These meetings are held once a term, but before them, we also hold meetings for each of our programs, BSc programs, MSc programs, or indeed streams within programs. So meetings between program directors on the one hand and student representatives on the other hand. Over the last few years, what we have been doing, and I think that has proved particularly beneficial in a variety of ways, is that we have been appointing students to act as co-chairs of staff-student liaison committees. And this includes joint responsibility with academic staff for setting the agenda for each of those meetings. Once staff-student liaison committee meetings take place, reports are produced very quickly, actually, because typically our teaching committee is just 1 week later, and we need those reports, are produced by our very efficient PS staff, and we review those reports at teaching committee, where students are once again invited to take part, at least for a significant part of those meetings. And of course, students are once again given the opportunity to raise points for discussion. Something that has come up repeatedly in the context of discussions at teaching committee, but related also to the SSLC meetings, has to do with the scores that the department gets in terms of our surveys. Those scores in the department have fluctuated over time. What is particularly important for us is to discuss with the students themselves those scores. Well, how do they explain the trends that we observe in the department? But also, equally, if not more importantly, we have been inviting students to help us understand what they understand when they ask particular questions in surveys. A characteristic example in this regard has to do with the concept of learning community. This is something that is that different surveys are trying to capture, and we think we know what students think. But is that the case? So we are trying to ask students to explain to us what they understand through particular questions in the surveys, partly with a view to us adjusting our communications to students. Why do I say this? It seems to us that sometimes we do things quite well, but we are not necessarily communicating to students what we do. So through this kind of discussion, open discussion, with students both at SSLC and teaching committee meetings, we are trying to dig further into this issue. We have also included students, like other departments, in the process of designing policy changes that respond to students' own previous feedback. A good example of this in my department has to do with something that we did a couple of years ago. So we secured funding through the Eden Center, and we worked with a group of MSc students to review our teaching portfolio and to develop recommendations for further decolonizing the curriculum. This is something that students themselves had repeatedly raised as a concern, as a desire. So in responding to students, we worked with students, or at least with a number of MSc students, to review our portfolio and develop recommendations. This resulted in an 83-page report entitled Decolonizing Social Policy, a First Step. which was then presented by students and by academic staff to the department. And since then, this took place in 2021-22, the academic year 21-22. Excuse me, 2021. And since then, as part of our ongoing effort in the department to further decolonize the curriculum, to diversify what we do pedagogically speaking, we use that report as the basis of self-reflective activities. We have undertaken other similar activities. I will not go into this now. I believe we run out of time. What I would like to say in finishing is that we have been trying not just to allow students to make their voices heard, but also to show them how their views matter in practice. At the same time, and I believe this is very important, not all suggestions, not all ideas proposed by students will be equally feasible or indeed desirable. And it is important to openly recognize this to students themselves. It is often said of students, not specifically LSE students, of students, that they are increasingly guided by a consumerist approach. I'm more optimistic. A practice in my own department suggests that being included in educational debates makes a lot of difference to students, even if they do not necessarily get what they have specifically asked for. So, thank you.
To end on what do we mean by truly being included? It's not necessarily responding with a yes to everything that's being asked for, but it's having your voice authentically heard. So Mark, you've been slightly crowded out, but I wonder if you could do a sort of truncated version of what you had planned. Mark is, for those who haven't met him yet, is our new Director of Student Experience.
Thanks. Earlier this month, Wonky produced a report around belonging. We've been talking about belonging in higher education for a while. I think the report includes some really interesting information, and anyone who's interested, I can send you the whole report. Some of you may have seen it already. They conclude that there are kind of four main foundations for creating a sense of belonging, and these are connection, inclusion, support, and autonomy. So I'll just say a very few words about each of those, and then I'm going to ask you to work in groups to answer some questions and have a think about what they mean from your position, your perspective in the school. So first of all, on connection, the research found a really strong correlation between belonging and having academic confidence, so having confidence in your own abilities as a student, which I think is really interesting. And they were contemplating that one way of trying to foment that, trying to promote that, would be to have more structured peer interactions as part of the curriculum, where students actually are required to work together in a collaborative way, so that they connect with each other, because connecting with each other is really important. The next one, probably less surprising, is around inclusion. People feel that they belong if the environment they're in feels inclusive to them, and that's probably no surprise to us at all. So the question I'll ask you to consider there in your groups is around how representative the course content is that you're delivering, but also the teaching staff, which is obviously much harder to change. The next thing that they said was a really key foundation for belonging in higher education was around the support that we provide, so all of the co-curricular stuff that we provide for our students. And they found that a really key one there is transition. So not just transition into higher education as first-year undergraduates or first-year masters, but actually the transitions once they're here as well. And some of us have been talking recently about second-year blues. So the transition that happens while you're at university, when the years that you're here are probably not going to be the same. And then the other aspect there that is really key is academic skills. Whether you build your academic skills more into the core curriculum or whether you offer it as an add-on, how you kind of approach that. And there are a couple of prompt questions for you to think of there too. And then finally, autonomy. So the more you can make people feel that they have certain agency in their learning at university, the stronger they will feel that they belong, which I think is a bit of an interesting paradox there. And they say that there are two ways of really promoting autonomy among our students. One is to give them choice, and I think we will normally our default position around choice is to think it's to do with course selection, which probably makes most people in the room kind of moan at the thought of talking about course selection again. But there are other ways of doing choice. How you give them choice in the projects that they choose, in their assessments, how you give them choice of essay questions. There are different ways of making choices available for students. And then the other way that really feeds nicely into some of the themes that have been emerging this afternoon is around co-creation. So the more that students are involved, again, it gives them agency to be involved in the life of the university. So if you could get yourselves into groups, I think maybe groups of 5, 4 or 5, something like that, I'll just give you a worksheet which has each of those foundations on it, and just 1 or 2 questions for you to consider. Given that we're a bit truncated, have a flick through all 4 and maybe decide in your group which one you want to start with, because you might end up having so much energy around one of them that you only do one of them. That's absolutely fine. Yeah? So let's dish them out here. We'll go right up till 4 o'clock for this. And we won't do a plenary, so you can use all of the time to discuss it. Okay?
If you have a chance to take 1 more minute and collect any ideas that you haven't had a chance to collect already and write them on the handout that Mark gave you, I think that would be really helpful. This is also a site of data collection, the Education Forum this afternoon, so thank you all very much. It's 3 minutes to 4, so I just wanted to close by thanking our colleagues online. I hope it's been a positive experience, even though you haven't been in the room with us today. You'll definitely be in our minds and in our dialogues and conversations. I want to thank everybody for coming today. Thank all our presenters, and thank everybody for listening carefully and engaging. And I do think that we need to continue to have these spaces to explore what we mean by genuinely giving our students voice, and that sort of processes of co-creation, which was very much a key theme coming out of the report that Mark shared with us. Sort of, what does it mean to genuinely co-create our communities together with our students? So thank you all very much. If anyone wants to suggest a theme for our next Education Forum in Lent term, drop us a line, and hope you all have a good end of term. Thanks for coming, and let's give everybody